Hello, this is Michael Centra, author of the sci-fi novella Energia and its upcoming sequel, Care of Existence. Before I proceed to outline why a group or population might want to form a state, I first want to make the listener familiar with my own concept of what a proper state is and should do. This is by no means the actual way our government is performing at present, but I do believe government and its policies are amendable to serving such a function through the democratic process. First, I will present my definition of a proper government. A government is a collaborative society's neutral platform for the debate, adoption, and implementation of economic, social, and political policies. Next, why we need a state and what a proper state does. A state or government ensures a neutral environment so no one voluntary resource management model dominates to the exclusion or impediment of all others. A state or government can also help ensure a specialized environment for citizens who voluntarily organize to create such a state with special considerations favoring a certain societal management philosophy. Anarchists often make the mistake in thinking that government is policy, but policy is what goes through government. The structure of government is neutral, or should be, to whatever policies its people and representatives process through government. But a government is not its policies. The level of force and related policies a government applies on its citizens is entirely amendable through the democratic process. The structure of a government does not take a stance one way or the other on the level of force to use on its citizens or what form of resource management to favor, if any. Its people do. Now that I have provided you with an idea of where I stand on the issue of what government is, does, or should do, I now want to address the constant refrain from anarchists who love to claim that the state is a useless entity and serves no legitimate purpose. So why people might want to form a state? First off, I want to clarify that the following commentary is about why a state might form, not how they might have formed in the past. In other words, what's a good reason for a state forming or existing? What two groups or people might consider a fair and sensible way to manage resources may differ greatly from each other, but still both remain legitimate and voluntary approaches. For instance, in regards to land management and distribution, one group might favor a land management style that sees no reason to place limits on the amount of land an individual can possess if they have enough of something called money. Another party might favor a land management style that quite naturally assumes limits on the size of land an individual could sensibly possess in order to follow a land management model that distributes that land for free to help achieve a more equitable and inclusive distribution of land access among a population. Both of these approaches may be seen as legitimate solutions to solving the issue of land distribution. One side wants to use access to money to solve the problem of land distribution amongst the populace. Another side wants to employ a simple idea on the fair distribution of land to make land free for all. Both are completely arbitrary but legitimate voluntary behaviors. There's nothing that says either approach is a wrong way of going about it. They are just two different ways of dealing with the same problem. Under an anarchy and sometimes under a state, both of these contrary approaches to land management will inevitably clash, however. To avoid clashing, one approach would invariably have to concede to the other, or both parties would be locked in a stalemate over how to proceed, and even violence could ensue. The money approach and free approach to land management and distribution are incompatible and will not recognize each other's claim. If you purchase 10 acres of land with money, a follower of the free approach to land management would be incapable of recognizing your claim, and you would equally see as invalid an advocate of free land distribution claiming an acre of land without payment. There are three ways of resolving this dilemma, and all involve invoking the hand of a higher authority or a state. One way is for each side to submit the decision of whose land distribution approach gets adopted and whose is rejected to a debate and vote, after which the implemented solution will be upheld and enforced by a larger authority or state. Another way to solve the dilemma is for one side or both sides to form a separate state which upholds their particular approach to land management in order to eliminate the possibility of conflict. The idea behind a separate state catering only to one approach is to make such matters more convenient to those that favor that approach and to avoid conflicts with those who don't. Still, a third way is for a state to enforce regulations that referee and provide a neutral landscape for competing voluntary approaches, so one approach cannot dominate to the inconvenience, interference, or exclusion of another. Thus, governments have a legitimate reason for forming and existing in providing convenience for groups advocating and practicing specific political or resource management philosophies and in settling disputes over conflicting ways to manage the planet. As a single business cannot function successfully, effectively, or remain in existence if its employees are all practicing different and opposing business models, so too specific political or resource management philosophies cannot serve their purpose or be pursued effectively by anyone if practices contrary to that specific political or resource management philosophy are allowed to compete and dominate to its marginalization and detriment. And so governments can legitimately form and exist for two reasons. One, to enforce a unified approach to political and resource management, whether by vote or by forming in the name of a single philosophy to avoid inefficiencies and clashes from competing philosophies. 2. To facilitate the practice and participation in competing political and resource management models without one model interfering detrimentally the pursuit and practice of another. In regards to the current conflict over the role and powers of government between the political right and the political left, the question is, do capitalists have any right to complain? Now, in the current political landscape, we admittedly have one side running to government for legislation and resources. That's the political left, my side. I'm certainly not above admitting that. And we have another side basically opposing that and advising that the population should instead submit themselves to the standards and consequences of competition in the free market. That's the political right. Fair enough. But do capitalists really have any right to complain? Isn't the reason people run to government for solutions in the first place is because they are struggling under the dominance of monetary capitalism? In other words, people are resisting capitalism due to the lack of viable alternative economic models where they can escape the necessity to practice capitalism. Capitalists and monetary advocates even concede not every individual is going to prefer or be suitable for participation in monetary capitalism. If a more neutral ground was provided for other resource management models to exist, there would be less people running to government to protect themselves from capitalism and a monetary system. Under an anarchy and under the principles of the free market, the argument is that, along with businesses, resource management model ideas should also be required to compete and allow the marketplace to determine which resource management model dominates. But this defeats and contradicts the alleged utility of a free marketplace. Indeed, what is the point of a free market if, as the capitalists keep insisting, capitalism is the only legitimate and functional economic model for resource management? Additionally, allowing different resource management models to compete for dominance amongst a population in the free market is not much different than allowing different ideas to compete for dominance in the legislative branch of a state. The result is much the same. One idea, whether in the free market or under the debate and scrutiny of our elected leaders in a legislative body, ultimately prevails to the inconvenience and disenfranchisement of the others due to its prevailing numerical acceptance by the population. Thus, neither approach does much to facilitate access by citizens to participation in voluntary resource management models that dissent or diverge from the dominant or trending model. And abolishing the state, as some anarchists suggest, will do nothing to resolve the problem of providing citizens of competing but voluntary resource management philosophies convenient avenues for participation and non-interference in the resource management model of their preference. However, a solution to the problem of convenience could be provided by a state through legislative action and regulation that would provide neutral access to participation in competing approaches to resource management regardless of the popularity or trending of one particular voluntary resource management philosophy over the others. In other words, the dominance or popularity of one voluntary resource management model over another would not be allowed to negatively impact the ability of citizens favoring dissenting approaches to practice their voluntary resource management model of preference. And that includes the practice and participation in anarchy itself. You do not have to disenfranchise all people from a state to practice anarchy. You can go through the state and enact laws that make it more convenient for citizens to dissolve their ties to the state and practice anarchy or any other political or resource management model where they are or close to where they are right now. That and all variations and implications which follow from it comprises my main argument for why a state can be a legitimate entity for governing cooperative human societies. But there are other reasons a population might find a state useful. These I regard as secondary reasons, but probably no less important. Environment. In matters involving future but real environmental threats, an anarchy can lack instruments to act when no agreement between parties can be attained. Under an anarchy, if two groups disagree on the actual environmental impact of a particular behavior of one group that might dispute the scientific evidence, without a contractual agreement, there is no way to enforce a moratorium on such behavior without breaking the non-initiation of force principle or going through debate in the branches of legislation of a state. Thus, because all groups share the same planet, all parties are in danger of suffering the consequences for the behavior of one dissenting group if action isn't taken under the authority of a democratic government. Nuclear weapons. Many anarchists have answered the question of how a stateless society could defend itself from the militaries of external powers if taxation to support a military was voluntary. Some anarchists have cited nuclear weapons as a cheap deterrent. But you cannot leave the security and protection of nuclear weapons up to a vote once you have them. Once you have nuclear weapons, you have to have a military to secure them and keep them from getting into the wrong hands. This means you are obligated to support a military from there on out if you want to maintain nuclear weapons as a deterrent to force from external powers. In other words, there's really no choice for the citizen of a stateless society at that point, and if you're not funding your military, you're just basically benefiting from free protection. That concludes my main presentation for why a state can legitimately form and exist. For this last part, I would like to reinforce my own position for why a democratic government is not an instrument of force. Anarchists will claim a state or government like the United States is initiating force on its citizens. But actually, in addition to all the other reasons I outlined in my force or inconvenience video as to why it's not force for yet another reason. And that reason is because it's actually self-defense. It's self-defense on the behalf of the citizen who turns to government and their elected leaders to pass legislation on their behalf and to enforce that legislation or defend it on their behalf. If such a relation existed under a contract between two parties in an anarchy, the imposition of force to punish or to maintain the terms of the contract that one party had broken would also be considered an instance of defending and upholding the rights of the other party. Of course, anarchists will protest that the citizen has signed no valid contract with the state. And obviously, that is an impossibility when you were born under a particular pre-existing political landscape. But the anarchists cannot dictate to others what qualifies as or what they choose to accept as a legitimate contract. If a citizen wants to accept the terms of citizenship they were born under, whether they signed anything or not, that's their right, as long as the citizen is offered avenues for escape and renunciation of citizenship. It is not force. Now, I realize a state doesn't always perform perfectly without corruption or enact laws that the minority or majority of the people will always favor. Money has been allowed to corrupt that process, and by only getting money out of government will the power of the people's voices return in full. Incidentally, that is what happens when a government favors one economic philosophy over alternatives. But that is not a reason to get rid of all governments any more than a corrupt business or a corrupt CEO within a business is a reason to rid the world of all businesses or even that particular company. There are other reasons to rid the world of all businesses, but that's another video.